minute.
Good to see you again. I hope you'll enjoy it. Yeah. How are you?
So, are your friends coming back?
No.
Not mine. I mean, it's not for them.
Search for 2 seats.
That's the question.
Yeah.
I don't wanna. Yeah, I need two.
Excuse me, giddy.
No, I'm just thinking that. Giddy, I saw you and I waved. This is what you do. You come from all the way over there and you don't even say hello.
No. It's
How long have you been here?
I've been here 2 days now, and then 2 days before.
And I always find out by coincidence of these things. But I mean, afterwards, are you going to be doing anything? That's good. How is everything? Is she here? I thought she was here.
I'm supposed to find 2 people.
Oh, okay.
And, do you have a card?
I don't have a card.
No, I'll give you mine. Right? I'll just get it out.
My next question is
Good evening, everyone. I'm Brian Mandel. I'm the faculty here at the Kennedy School. I am also in the privileged position of being the director of our project on Middle East peace, something that I think we all crave and all want to hear the insights from our guests this evening. We have a unique partnership in this project. We work with the Economic Cooperation Foundation in Israel, and we work with the Palestinian Policy and Survey Research Center and Program in Ramallah. And together with the Kennedy School, we are trying to explore some options for thinking hard about the peace process. Great projects demand great insight, and they demand great support. I often at these seminars and public places don't get to thank those who help us in this. And tonight I would like to publicly thank Mr. Sid Topple for his leadership, for his encouragement and support in this initiative. So Sid, thank you very much. My task tonight is to moderate what I like to call in my classes is in essence a learning conversation. And so to set the frame for this evening, this is not a public debate. It is to be about dialogue and learning. We will hear from our discussants, our key participants shortly, but I just want to do a little bit in setting the stage for us as we begin our evening of shared diagnosis. We sit here with giants in the peace process. We sit here with individuals who, in the very best sense, are scholar practitioners. Many of us get critical of academics who come up with fine theories of negotiation and peacemaking. Many of us are critical of those who do not take risks for peace. We have a unique privilege in sitting with these individuals here tonight to hear from individuals who have walked the talk, who have gone through the risks, political, emotional, and human, of trying to bring parties together in this difficult conflict, and have done so tirelessly over the past several years. Let me say that I think we are also at a unique moment here. The United States of America is now in the final phases of what the Pentagon would call the combat phase of activities in Iraq. The United States needs to think about how it's going to rethink its role in the Middle East. The Palestinian community is thinking hard about reform, and as we speak, there is an ongoing, very difficult political battle between Messrs. Arafat and Abu Mazen about understanding the future role of the Palestinian leadership in moving forward toward peace. At the same time, not too long ago, Prime Minister Sharon was reelected as Israel's prime minister. President Bush has committed himself through the quartet's roadmap to engage the region in serious peacemaking. We will hear from our colleagues here what it takes to be serious about peacemaking. And I think that we are at an important tipping point here in whether the parties themselves have determined whether the costs of not cooperating have finally reached the point of exhaustion, and that the moment is now ripe, as my colleague Bill Zartman often likes to coin the phrase, ripe for resolution, that the parties are ready to try and to do something different with the assistance of some able and willing third parties. Tonight, we have with us, and I am pleased and honored to introduce Professor Khalil Shahaki, a professor of political science based in Ramallah. I would argue that he is the leading, and I stress the word leading, Palestinian authority of understanding what is happening in what we often call in the news media the Palestinian street. He is an outstanding and careful pollster and carefully reads Israeli perceptions and Palestinian perceptions of what is happening both on the ground and what is happening in the unique nature of their relationship. He has written widely and most recently on trying to understand the lessons of the Oslo peace process. Sitting next to Halil, Professor Yair Hirschfeld. Yair, as a brilliant academic, came up with an idea in 1992 that he was then able to sell to the late Prime Minister Rabin, that why don't we try to initiate a unique dialogue with the Palestinians, some of our colleagues, and do so in secret while talks are going on at the formal level in Washington. And Yair pioneered that important process. On my far left, Ambassador Dennis Ross, known to many of you in circles here. No individual in recent history has worked as tirelessly, has persevered in most difficult circumstances with difficult Israeli and Palestinian leaderships, to say the least, in the hopes of bringing these parties toward a more manageable situation. Dennis, I think, brings to this activity both unique scholarship and the work of the practitioner, and I think that that's what will make our particular evening unique. In the spirit of this learning conversation, I have asked our colleagues to speak about three issues. First, what are the lessons from the Oslo peace process? Understanding the nature of failures, the nature of setbacks, and perhaps for these very skilled and very insightful scholar practitioners to understand the missed opportunities throughout this past decade. After we each of our participants has time to comment on that, we will then have a discussion of recent efforts at Palestinian reform and some discussion of the roadmap. As we witness now, as you've read in the papers in the past couple of days, there's a very serious struggle going on within the top Palestinian leadership about the future role of Abu Mazen and what ultimately Mr. Arafat's role will be. And finally, given the unique intervention that the United States has engaged in the region over the past couple of months, we want to understand what the Bush administration might have in mind for next steps in terms of Middle East peacemaking. So let's go directly to those. We'll have about 40 minutes discussion here from our participants, and then we will open the floor to questions. So perhaps, Halil, you can get us started on some lessons from the Oslo process.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. I hate to begin by talking about the failure of Oslo, particularly sitting next to Yair. I'm intimidated, to tell you the truth.
Well, the purpose of the evening is I understand Yair invented the process. Dennis tried to dig us out of the process, and you're just trying to
demolish
understand
it.
Yes.
Okay. You're putting me on the defense.
So I want to start by saying that the Oslo process has not been all but a failure, or that it was a total collapse. And there is no doubt that the Oslo process had some strategic benefits for both sides, Israelis and Palestinians. The Palestinians here in this context would be the PLO, which was transformed from a minor organization in Tunis into a Palestinian authority. And Israel was able to sign a peace deal with Jordan and was able to improve its strategic posture in the whole region as a result of the deal that is called Oslo. And there is no doubt that the Oslo process transformed the whole psychological environment of Palestinians and Israelis. Without Oslo, I doubt very much that both publics today, we know for certain that both publics are fully committed to a two-state solution. This is something that certainly wasn't there before Oslo. And we know that both societies began to change their attitude with regard to the role of violence as a result of the success of Oslo. Unfortunately, this has changed now, but there was a time when both sides began to look at the role of violence in a new light. And as a result of that change in attitude with regard to violence, we now know that attitudes, Israeli and Palestinian attitudes are changeable. That is, conflict is not inevitable. People do change their views and their minds, and that we can do it again. If we succeeded at one point, we certainly can do it again. And I do not believe for a second that the failure, not for a second, that the failure at Camp David and after Camp David only exposed the fact that there are some fundamental clash of interest involving between the two sides that conventional diplomacy cannot bridge. I do not accept that at all, as I do not accept the idea that the Palestinian national movement or Arafat, the head of the mainstream national movement, is incapable of reaching a peace agreement with Israel. Having said all this, I do have problems, and I do have three major problems with Oslo. The first and most important problem, I believe, had to do with the fact that Oslo was open-ended. Maybe there was absolutely no other way of reaching an agreement that we can call Oslo without having that agreement being an open-ended agreement. But I believe with hindsight, we're looking back, we know that open-ended agreement meant there was absolutely no certainty that that process is going to take us, Palestinians and Israelis, to our vital objectives. That uncertainty created a dynamic that made it impossible for either side to make a full commitment to the process, and meant that, in fact, if you cannot make a full commitment to the process, you are not going to fight those instruments that you've used in the past in order to sustain the conflict. So settlement construction could not be stopped because of that open-ended nature of the process, and Palestinian violence could not also be stopped because of that the leadership on both sides did not feel it had enough legitimacy to confront those instruments of the past because of the uncertainty that was created by the open-ended nature of the process. It meant, in fact, that you would seek, do your best to improve your negotiating position, which meant that you would give up as little as possible in order to keep your assets for the final or permanent status negotiations. The open-ended nature of the process was one major fundamental error. A second one had to do with the fact that Israel got what it wanted right from the start. Front-loading gains, strategic gains for Israel, back-loading gains for the Palestinians. The Palestinians were to get things in the future. So nothing of the Palestinian vital needs in Jerusalem, borders, statehood, refugees, nothing would be achieved as a result of Oslo. Instead, they would be admitted to the negotiating table. They would start a process, but none of their vital needs would be achievable as a result of an immediate gain from Oslo. Israel, on the other hand, would immediately get recognition from the Palestinians, would immediately get renunciation of violence, and would immediately get a Palestinian authority that is intent on fighting violence. What did this do? Well, it meant that the Israelis are no longer have the motivation to continue to give. If they have already taken what they wanted, why should they continue to give? By the same token, the Palestinians all of a sudden discovered that they were trapped. If the Israelis won't give anymore, the motivation for the Palestinians was to take back what they have already given. And the third problem is the issue of what is now political reform and democracy. I believe, whether this was Yair's intentions or not, Rabin, because of the preeminence or even the hegemony of security in the whole deal, Rabin wanted to make a deal based on the legitimacy of a legacy, the PLO legacy. It's for this reason that he preferred to negotiate in Oslo in secret rather than in Washington in the open, because the Washington talks was talks with young guards in the Palestinian national movement. This was not the legacy. These were people who would have to go back and earn their legitimacy through elections. Rabin, on the other hand, wanted a legacy, the legitimacy of a legacy, because he didn't believe that democracy would produce a Palestinian authority that would fight terrorism. For this reason, he wanted to make a deal with Arafat and the PLO in Tunis and bring them to the West Bank and Gaza so that they can create a police force and a police state that would be capable of delivering security to Israel, but forget about democracy with the Palestinians. For these three reasons, I believe Oslo failed.
Perhaps also in your comments, you might be able to address part of what you and your colleagues had in your minds in the sense of design, in the sense of incremental versus comprehensive approaches, and how step-by-steps might have deferred the vitals and then, in fact, undermined in the long term what you were trying to do.
First of all, I was afraid at the beginning that we would be of the same opinion. I'm not so much afraid of one anymore. You started with the successes of Oslo, which I agree that we changed the atmosphere and the idea about a two-state solution. And today, both sides want a two-state solution. And I believe this is very important. But let me start with the most important failure. The most important failure of Oslo was our hope that we would lead the way gradually towards a permanent status deal. And there's no question that we failed in that. Now, the truth is that the concept from the beginning was that we thought that you have to create, you cannot, and I can explain more in detail, it will take me too much time, you could not in 1993 go for a permanent status agreement. It was impossible. Neither side was willing to go there. No side had thought about it. Neither body politic was there. But you could go to a gradual process where there was a sliding scale understanding that the Palestinians will build up their state in the being gradually, one step after the other. But we also knew when we concluded Oslo, when it was signed on the White House lawn on September 13, we knew that we had to move fast. Our understanding was that we had to move fast and to go also gradually, but very quickly, to a permanent status deal. And as a matter of fact, if you check the records, if you listen to Prime Minister's speech to the Knesset on the 5th of October 1995, which is 1 month minus 1 day before the day he was assassinated, he very clearly said in the Knesset, I will go for permanent status deal still under this Knesset period. That meant until November 1996. So the basic meaningful concept of Oslo was to move quickly towards permanent status. And I believe that in the first 2 or 3 years, the moment to move quickly to an understanding on all the issues you're speaking about, it would have been actually far easier than afterwards, where a lot of confidence was broken. And let me look into the issues where confidence was broken. The understanding, let me say 1 or 2 other things to you that you have said to get the air a little bit hotter. On Washington, on the Washington negotiations, we did in Oslo a very interesting exercise. We got the protocols of the negotiations. We cut off the dates. Well, we didn't cut off the dates, but they were cut off. And they tried, and they gave us the job to see which one was first, which came afterwards. Nobody was able of doing that. It was very clear that you could go on negotiations in Washington for at least until 2222, maybe 1 year earlier, but not less than that. There was no way of concluding the deal in Washington, and nobody who's been to Washington would claim something different. So there was no choice. The second thing which I believe is important, we if we went quickly, we would have moved quickly to front-loaded Israeli advantages. But the main condition was to go on a non-violent deal. We were promised non-violence in Oslo. It never happened. It never really happened. And if I look back at one of the major mistakes made, and I must say, was made partly by, not partly, but mainly by Prime Minister Rabin. He said we will negotiate if there would be no violence, and we will fight violence if there would be no negotiations, which was looking back at something Ben-Gurion had said earlier. And in the end, well, we've totally failed. We failed to convince the Palestinian side that the policy of violence would undermine negotiations, and the policy of non-violence would make movement quicker to negotiations. And this is definitely our failure, but it is we share the failure together. A policy which would have made sense, and I believe this is a practical policy, not what Netanyahu said afterwards, if there's violence, stop to negotiate, and every boy who throws a stone can stop the negotiations. But it was the damned obligation of Arafat and of the Palestinian Authority to provide security for the Palestinian people and for us. And if there's violence, it was all too easy to believe on the Palestinian side that violence would be useful in negotiations. And what we could have done, and we should have done, and we still have to do, is to say, if there's violence, and particularly if it's state-supported violence, we have to stop the negotiations on permanent status, and we have to intensify our cooperation on security issues, and we have to give more authority and more responsibility to the Palestinian security people to do the job, and not always do the job by ourselves. I believe this is a very important lesson which is useful for the future. Let me say something on democracy. It was Rabin's, if the concept was to move fast, the understanding was that the legitimacy of the two leaders, Rabin and Arafat, would be capable of moving fast to a deal. And then Oslo provided some provisions for democracy, particularly in the September 1995 part, the second part. But then actually the real democracy building will be in a state, and it's easier if there's a state in order to do it. And Arafat's personal legitimacy would go through. That was the assumption. Now, it was never the assumption that Israel could build up democracy on the Palestinian side. And it's not the damned responsibility of the Palestinians to build up their own. With all due respect, I don't think they have to import Western democracy. I have nothing against Western democracy. But what the promise was, and the understanding was, is that Arafat would build up, together with the Palestinian people in the West Bank and Gaza, state institutions which will be embedded in Palestinian society. It wouldn't have to be full democracy. But those state institutions were not built up. Now, they were not built up because of us. Now, they were not built up because Arafat's way of handling things was simply to outmaneuver this process. And part of the reform is to look into that, how do you look into and re-establish that in a better way. The logic of where we go from is that I believe Oslo has shown that both sides, and here I also disagree with you, I agree and disagree, both sides have a vested interest to go to a two-state solution. Israel has a vested interest to move towards a border, internationally recognized border to its east, and Gaza also to its west, which the only real people who give the legitimacy for the border are the Palestinians. So we had a major incentive to go to permanent status. I believe that the Israeli people in 1999 and 2000 wanted to go to permanent status. If you ask me, there were many mistakes done in the negotiations, but in the end, the Palestinian side didn't move towards a permanent status deal. And on that, I wouldn't blame Oslo, but I would blame the way that negotiations were held on both sides, on the Barak side and Arafat side, and this is an issue for itself.
Yeah, you're just before going to Ambassador Ross. certainly up until 92, 93, a central tenet of how business got done in the Middle East was that the U.S. was called upon to play a central mediating role. What did you and your colleagues decide about not speaking to the Americans about what was happening in Oslo? It's a sort of a diplomatic question. Why didn't somebody call Dennis and tell him what was happening?
I was from the very beginning informing Dan Kurtz of the negotiation. So there was information was given on to the Americans, and the Norwegians were informing Christopher, Secretary of State Christopher, what was going on. In May in Oslo, there were negotiations for the multilaterals on the refugee issue. There was an incident where an American diplomat started to leak things out of his personal vanity. And if I would be in the Department of State, I would have thrown him out of the Department of State forever. I understand he was heavily reprimanded. He got heavy.
Caning actually was what happened.
What? Caning?
Caning.
I don't know what that means. But from that moment on, I got the order not to report anymore to the Americans. So why this was partly the fault of this idiot, forgive me, which I never knew his name, but I knew he was stationed in Norway, and the second more deep
And his address was...
and the second reason which was behind that was that there was Shimon Peres's memory of the what he understood as Schultz letting him down after the London agreement.
Yeah.
It had an impact on Peres saying it was easy for Peres to tell me or tell anybody else, don't report anymore to the Americans.
Ambassador Ross.
Well, I'll pick up on that and then I'll go back to the main question. It is Dan Kurtz who reported to me what it is we had heard. In fact, we received the papers that had been drafted in the spring that you had done. And given what we were hearing from the Washington negotiations, we thought they were too good to be true. But we didn't totally dismiss them until we went to Rabin, and Rabin dismissed them. Rabin throughout this period was dismissing this. Even when
On this I have to...
with Christopher and I were meeting with Rabin in early August, when you were right at the point where basically you were on the brink of having an agreement. And Yossi Beilin told Dan, who was not in these meetings, but he was on the trip with us, that you were right on the brink of having an agreement. And so I asked Rabin, I said, look, we're hearing from some of your guys that you're right on the brink of having an agreement with the PLO. He was completely dismissive at that point. Now, I will tell you, this will be out in my book as well, that in July, when I had seen Rabin alone, he actually shared with me a letter that he'd gotten from Arafat, which had given him, for the first time, some confidence that it was possible to reach an agreement with the PLO. But he still was dismissive, and even when he called Christopher to have Christopher and I go to Point Magoo to hear from Peres and Holst, he said, he said, Peres has achieved a breakthrough. I want to hear what you think of it. So even when he was doing this, he was reserving a little bit with regard to the nature of the breakthrough. All right, back to the main story.
Yeah, we're going to go to the main story now, and you will have a chance.
Afterwards.
Okay.
All right.
Give my side of the story, which does not contradict, but
Just
Mr.
amplifies.
Ambassador.
Let me give a perspective on Oslo that I don't know that it's different than what I've just heard, but it certainly maybe explains it in a somewhat different fashion. I would start with the basic failing being one that Oslo promised a transformation of attitudes but didn't produce a transformation of attitudes. There's no doubt that at the top, on the Israeli side, the words were right, the music was right, but the behaviors of the Israelis who had day-to-day responsibility with the Palestinians didn't change. On the Israeli side, basically, they were supposed to devolve authority to the Palestinians. And on the Palestinian side, they were supposed to provide security. There was a basic bargain. The basic bargain was Israel is going to, in effect, devolve authority, and meaning give up control of the Palestinians and pave the way towards independence or freedom for the Palestinians. and what the Palestinians are going to do is take care of Israeli security. That was the core bargain. Now, the problem from the Israeli standpoint is the people who had the day-to-day responsibility found it very difficult to give up control. And on the Palestinian side, I would go beyond what you said. They renounced violence in the September 9th, 1993 letter. But there was never an effort throughout Oslo to delegitimize violence as a tool. It was when acts of terror took place, even if what Halil says is right, that Arafat didn't have the kind of legitimacy to crack down. From the very beginning, he didn't do anything to make it clear, we've made a judgment, we've made a decision. It's a strategic pathway that we're now on. And that strategic pathway says there's a legitimate way to pursue our cause, and we'll never give it up. And there's an illegitimate way to pursue our cause. And the illegitimate way is to pursue it through violence. That was never done. And the consequence was when arrests would be made, and they were made, and sometimes they were serious, they were never justified in terms of what these people have done is a threat to our cause. They were never done in a way designed to discredit those who carried out violence. So if you didn't do that, the core requirement on the Palestinian side in terms of transforming attitudes wasn't going to be met. On the Israeli side, the core attitude of deciding, you know what, we're really going to give them this responsibility. And it means that, whether it's in the economic area, or it's in the civil area, or it's in the security area, in these particular areas, this is now a Palestinian responsibility. But that didn't happen. So the first failing, I would say, of Oslo was not the logic of Oslo per se, but the absence of a transformation of the attitudes, which would have demonstrated that it was indeed a new day, not just rhetorically, but practically. Related to that, there was no accountability built into this process. There were all sorts of commitments that each side took on, and when they didn't fulfill them, there was no accountability. It was a little bit difficult for us in the early stages to create accountability because we hadn't negotiated the Declaration of Principles they had. We weren't a part of the negotiating history. It was a little different later on when, in fact, we took a very different role. But even then, we didn't do one of the things that we could have done, at least later on. Early on, I think it would have been difficult, having not negotiated the DOP. But later on, since both sides, for very different reasons, wanted us involved, we should have made it clear that there was a condition for our involvement, and that was fulfilling responsibilities and making it clear that if both sides didn't fulfill their responsibilities, one of two things would happen. First, we would publicly say that they weren't fulfilling their responsibilities based on what they themselves had committed to. And secondly, we would not continue our involvement if they didn't fulfill their responsibilities. There had to be a consequence. Accountability without consequence is no accountability at all. Third failing, I think, and this especially is important when you think about permanent status, there was no conditioning of public attitudes for compromise. There was there wasn't a readiness to begin to say, we're going to have to do some difficult things. Now, this was more true on the Israeli side, not through either the Rabin or Peres or Netanyahu administrations. In the case of Rabin and Peres, they could say, well, we're just dealing with the interim issues. So permanent status comes later. In the case of Netanyahu, we were just trying to hold on to a process. In the case of Barak, he did conditioning in the sense that he talked about painful compromises that would be required, although he approached conditioning in what I can only describe as a creative way. It was never done overtly other than saying there'll have to be painful compromises. The painful compromises were never described, but they were then leaked basically to the press, so that I faced a negotiation unlike any I was ever involved with, where what was being said in private lagged so far behind what was being leaked in public that the private negotiations were far less interesting than reading the Israeli press. But the Israeli press did become a vehicle for getting the Israeli public used to what was going to have to happen. So that when we were at Camp David and suddenly it came out that, depending upon how the Israeli press described it, up to 99% of the territory would have to be given up, it didn't draw a reaction because by that time the public was used to it. On the Palestinian side, there wasn't conditioning. Arafat never talked about real compromise. He never implied that you'd get anything less than 100%. And in fact, I think one of our failings now was that we should have created certain kinds of tests, again, for our own involvement. Arafat in particular wanted us involved because we equalized things for him in the negotiations. we demonstrated again what has always been his strength. His great strength is what he produces for the Palestinians on the international stage.
Right.
And we were the great power. What we should have done is make it very clear, if you're not prepared to condition for peace, we're not prepared to stay involved, and here's what's required. Now, interestingly enough, had he been unwilling to do it, which I suspect he would have, then we could have redefined what the objective was, meaning you don't go for a full deal. If he had been prepared to do it, my guess is his approach would have changed dramatically, because under those circumstances, he would have exposed himself very quickly to criticism, and then he would have needed to produce to show that his way was working. So I think that was a failing on our side with the Palestinians. And with the Israelis, I think one of the things that we failed on is we didn't push hard enough to get them to truly devolve authority and responsibility. That should have been much more of what we should have
Or
done
stop the
over time.
settlement construction.
Pardon?
Or stop the settlements.
Well, should we have made the settlements an issue? Yes, we should have made the settlements an issue. Not because legally they were required by the agreement, because they weren't. There was nothing in there that prevented the Israelis from doing what they were doing. But in a sense, it undercut the psychology of what this was about. Supposedly, this is about negotiating over what the future of the land is going to be. I mean, when James Carville said, is the economy stupid? Well, for the Palestinians, it's the land stupid.
Yep.
And if the land looked like it was being taken to settlement activity, it wasn't only that it seemed to be inconsistent with the spirit of what was involved, it also was a manifestation that the Palestinians were powerless to stop it. And if you create a sense of powerlessness, then you're going to produce a reaction. So yes, we could have done more in that regard. But if I were to use one word as the overriding word, I'd say the absence of accountability. Got each side very used to the idea that even though they'd made commitments, they could slide on. And unfortunately, there you saw it on both sides.
Okay. Let's keep moving our conversation along. The Bush administration comes to office, and it's had enough of both mediation, of special ambassadors. It thinks it can go a different route in the Middle East, in part by not paying attention. At the same time, the Bush administration, long before speaking about regime change in Iraq, is talking publicly about the need for changes in the Palestinian leadership as a precondition for moving peace talks forward with Israel. This has generated, I think, over the past number of months, some serious internal struggle and debate amongst the Palestinian leadership. And more of this debate has been fueled by the still to be published roadmap put together by a quartet of the Russians, the UN, the US, the European Union. And so what I thought it might be useful to hear from Khalil, from Yair, and from Ambassador Ross is the extent to which these internal struggles, the external pressures from the international communities are creating some new opportunities and barriers for the peace process. Tell us a little bit about the view from Ramallah.
I do believe that Palestinian political reforms are essential for Palestinians. I do not believe, however, that regime change has anything to do with the peace process. And it remains to be seen, but I fear that the June 24th speech by the President, in which he articulated the vision about regime change, may prove to be a major U.S. foreign policy blunder. And I think it may, in fact, be derailing any effort to return back to the negotiations. There is, again, absolutely no point in arguing that political reform is essential for Palestinians, and that political reform is something that the overwhelming majority of Palestinians want in all areas, including reform at the leadership level. There is no doubt that the majority of Palestinians fully support the appointment of a prime minister and would like to see Mr. Arafat being gradually removed from daily decision-making about Palestinian governance. But most Palestinians believe regime change is not about good governance, have absolutely nothing to do with democracy or an American commitment to democracy, and has a lot more to do with an American effort to keep away from the process, reduce American risks as much as possible, risk of failure as much as possible for the president, and again, in the perception of the Palestinians, that regime change is more about creating a leadership that is more willing to accept the crumbs from Sharon, giving the constraints that are imposed on the peace process by the current Israeli government. Having said all of this, and given the fact that today we have a prime minister designate who is trying to form a government, I think it is very clear that because the link is extremely established and solidly established between the peace process and the appointment of a prime minister, everything that the prime minister is trying to do is seen not through the lens of good governance and the ability and the desire of the Palestinians to have accountability in their political system, but rather in terms of what this will do for the peace process. And the expectation that a prime minister, such as Abu Mazen, would be more willing to crack down on Palestinian militias and on violence and terror, and that he would be willing to take the risk of civil war, and that he would be willing to accept a deal that the majority of Palestinians would not find fair, and that for this reason, Abu Mazen will find it more difficult rather than less difficult to establish a government. And that Arafat, in his attempt to prevent Abu Mazen from, in fact, sharing power with him, will use Palestinian fears and exaggerate those fears, the fear that Abu Mazen will indeed implement a program that could indeed lead to civil war, at a time when most Palestinians' perception of reality is Sharon isn't a partner for peace. He isn't going to be willing at any point in the near future to engage in any serious negotiations with the Palestinians. To the contrary, Israel is continuing with its settlement policy, expanding settlements, building a wall that again is eating up Palestinian land and making it more and more difficult, if not impossible, for the parties to sit down at the negotiating table. And that, therefore, this reality means that a crackdown on Palestinian violence today isn't going to achieve the desired objective of reviving the peace process, because the conditions are not there. The prospects for a negotiating deal isn't there. The American administration is not interested. The Sharon administration isn't going to be willing to make the compromise that would be required for any revival of the peace process, and that the only thing that Abu Mazen would therefore accomplish is simply internal Palestinian strife. It is this link, therefore, that the link between the peace process, fighting violence, and Palestinian reform that is embodied in this notion of regime change that I believe is disastrous.
Let me see how things could work. I'm not necessarily this is the way it will work. You have tomorrow Abu Mazen forms his government.
Yes.
Literally tomorrow. The day after, the quartet submits to him the roadmap. But the roadmap says actually three things. First, stability building. Second, establishment of a Palestinian state with provisional borders. Negotiations then thirdly to a permanent status. And permanent status, basically we have a blueprint which is, as the Israeli government has accepted and the Palestinians have largely accepted, which are the Clinton proposals. We're not negotiating open-endedly. We are today negotiating that the basis, the blueprint for a deal is there. So the next thing then would be that a monitoring system is put in system. The put in charge. An American would be on top of the monitoring system. I think they already have the man. You move on establishing a reworked security system on the Palestinian side, which needs unity of command. There's no unity of command. There's no way to stabilize the situation. You'll need the establishment of a strong Palestinian blue police force. And you move towards negotiations on a Palestinian state with provisional borders, which means that Israel will have to start to relocate settlements and to draw settlements out in order to establish the contiguity of a Palestinian state. You could theoretically also say that the Palestinian side comes up with a Palestinian peace plan, which goes more or less along the Clinton lines, is more detailed, and the Palestinians say to us, Israelis, we are moving towards a two-state solution. We want a two-state, we want a border with you, we want to see that there will be end of occupation, and I believe there will be a lot of movement and notion to move ahead on that. Now, the truth is that this is not the most likely scenario that's going to happen. The truth is that between ongoing quagmire and stabilization and destabilization, and this, we're probably going through a zigzag line. What I would say is that we should look shortly at Susan Strange's definition of power. She defines power in 3 concentric circles. The first is the power of the decision makers, Bush, Sharon, and Arafat and Abu Mazen, and the people who take the decisions on one hand. The second circle is the circle of institutions, which will be governmental institutions and non-governmental institutions. And the third circle is the circle of the thinking process, the intellectual process, how to get there. On the intellectual process, we are close to a clear understanding where we know we don't have to have an open-ended process. We actually look at a closed-ended process, and we intellectually can look very seriously into say, how do you move from here further onward? And I believe that given the roadmap, given the decision, the determination of the Palestinian intellectual community, the Israeli intellectual community, the existing institutions that do exist, there is a possibility to move out of the quagmire into something that will be far more constructive and lead to a two-state solution with the end of occupation for the Palestinians and the clear understanding of Israel's acceptance in the Middle East. So I think it's possible. I don't think it's easy. Maybe too idealistic.
Ambassador Ross has been on the road to Y, the road to Shepherdstown, the road to Camp David, and yet again another roadmap. So,
yeah, the question is it a map that leads on a road, or is it a map that produces a cul-de-sac? And let me say the following about what I've heard. First, we are at a disastrous point as a practical fact of life. The condition of the Palestinians today is, there's no other way to use or to describe it except as a disaster. There's no question that at this point there is a strong desire on the Palestinian side to change the circumstances. On the Israeli side, I think there also is a strong desire to change the circumstances. So that creates a convergence of some interest. I think there's a convergence on the near term. There's not a convergence on the long term. You are right about the intellectual reality, but there's a huge gap between the intellectual reality and the political reality. And the challenge is going to be, how do you move from where we are to a point where what is intellectually sort of internalized to what is politically practical? The roadmap represents a vehicle for trying to do that. But it has, in my mind, a fundamental flaw, the way it's been constructed. Don't get me wrong on this. I believe there should be a roadmap, but it had to be constructed differently than it has been, at least in the following sense. There need to be Arab responsibilities built into this roadmap, of which there are not. I mean, you are asking Abu Mazen to assume certain responsibilities with regard to cracking down on those who reject peaceful coexistence and use violence as their means of rejecting it. At a time when they've never been delegitimized throughout the whole Oslo process, at a time when Arafat will resist what he's doing, which is also the reason that he resists the appointment of Dahlan, not because I think necessarily that the Israeli definition of what the Palestinians have to do and Abu Mazen and Dahlan's definition of what they have to do is necessarily the same, but they do understand they have to do more on the ground against those who are committed to violence than has been the case up until now. And Arafat is going to resist that. Now, the critical question is, what can be done to create a greater aura of legitimacy for Abu Mazen as he acts? It's not going to come from us, and it's not going to come from the Europeans. It has to come, I think, from two sources. Ironically, it has to come from the Israelis, not by embracing him, but allowing him to show that he can produce, that life will change, it will get better, people and goods can move, schools can reopen, a kind of normality is possible again, the Palestinian society can breathe. Now, the Israelis aren't going to do that if as soon as they do that, they got a lot of dead Israelis because there are suicide bombers that go back to work. So he will have to do something, but the Israelis will also, I think, have to find ways to help create an environment where he looks like he's producing, and he, in fact, goes beyond appearing to produce, but actually produces. Here, I think, by the way, in addition to allowing people to breathe again, if there were symbolic steps taken on settlements at the same time or in relatively close proximity, it would allow him to look successful on two fronts. One is that life got a lot better, and I think the Palestinian desire to want to breathe again is reflected in the fact that 71% of the Palestinians now would like to see the violence end, which wasn't the case before. So if he can show that life is getting better, that is one thing that builds his authority. If he can show that land isn't going to be taken, that's another way to show that his way is working. The others who can help him are Arabs. Take the troika of the Saudis, the Jordanians, and the Egyptians, who like to define themselves now as a group who are prepared to work on the peace process. If they were prepared to create a kind of joint manifesto with him on what constitutes legitimate action and what constitutes illegitimate action, if they were to make it clear they will back him in terms of what he does, practically, psychologically, materially, then he, I think, has more of a chance to operate and be successful in terms of affecting his side of what is going to be the new bargain. Here, I think it's very important to create a reconciliation between Israeli expectations and Palestinian capabilities. The roadmap, in a sense, can be a backdrop to what would be understandings between the Israelis and the Palestinians to change the situation on the ground now. Today, there is no trigger for the roadmap. So Abu Mazen, if things work out, establishes a government tomorrow. If they don't work out and he doesn't establish a government tomorrow, I'm with Khalil. I think we're in big trouble.
I'm with
Because
you, unfortunately, I agree.
It becomes a perfect excuse to do nothing. And we've seen the last 2.5 years the consequences of doing nothing. So you need, in my mind, understandings between the Israelis and the Palestinians, in a sense, to create an unfolding of the roadmap, or at least their own interpretation of it. Because let's understand one other fundamental flaw in the roadmap. It has 52 paragraphs. As I said to you over dinner, that means there are 208 separate points in the roadmap. I can tell you, I may be one of the few people alive who could write the 208 Palestinian interpretation of those points and the 208 Israeli interpretation of those points, and I can promise you they bear nothing in common. So a roadmap that is entitled the performance-based roadmap, instead of being a basis on which to evaluate performance, is going to be a basis on which to debate performance, in which case we are likely to have a dead letter. The roadmap, after all, isn't a lot that's new. What it has is the tenant work plan, which originally was crafted at the Sharm el-Sheikh summit in October of 2000, refined in the spring, in June of 2001, the Mitchell report from the spring of 2001, the concept of a state with provisional borders, which was actually something that we tried at Camp David and had it turned down. So it isn't that the ideas there are particularly new, it's that this is supposed to be a practical approach to get both sides to fulfill reciprocal obligations. But if they don't have either a common understanding, and I don't favor spending the next 3 years trying to negotiate the common understanding, or if the United States isn't prepared to sort of give its interpretation of what is required, it's very hard for me to see this develop absent what will be understandings between the Israelis and the Palestinians. If you have those understandings, the roadmap becomes a useful backdrop because Abu Mazen can point to it as being a political horizon. If you don't have those understandings, I'm afraid you don't go anyplace. And it becomes, as I said also, an excuse for saying, well, we tried.
Let's just, before we go to the microphones, just hear from the participants. The hour is late, and I want to make sure we have time for questions from the floor. Just a minute reaction from your perspective on going forward, what the appropriate third-party role for the U.S. Should be. But just briefly, and then folks can start to get ready to come up to the mics. Yeah.
There is no doubt that the Palestinians and Israelis do not trust each other, and there is no doubt that the leadership level, each side believes that there is no negotiating partner on the other side, and that therefore there is an essential role for the third party, particularly for the United States, I believe, to lead the process and to be able, in fact, not only to provide the ideas and certainly much clearer ideas. I agree with Dennis that the roadmap has a lot of generalities and very little clear details that the two sides can have a shared vision on whether it is on the long term or even the short term. And this is where U.S. leadership would be extremely essential. But one of the things that we have learned from Oslo is to measure performance. And there is no doubt that unless there is a third party that can, in fact, monitor the performance of both sides, and therefore create the expectations that each side expects, complete fulfillment of commitments, and therefore create the incentive on each side to implement their commitments and report to the other side the fulfillment of the commitment. This is certainly an extremely important role to play for the Americans, but also for the other members of the quartet. And it's this other involvement, other international involvement, that I believe is extremely important. It's important for the United States to keep this quartet working together, because the quartet not only give ideas and monitor, but could also give legitimacy to the whole process, a process that is led by the United States, a country that most Palestinians believe is 100% biased and has little fair-minded approach to the Palestinian needs. When the quartet becomes directly involved, plays a significant role in leading the process, monitoring its implementation, I think it gives legitimacy to the process that is extremely needed.
Let me say one sentence. The United States has to do two things. Make it clear that it has the political will and determination to make the roadmap work, and number two, create accountability of both sides to implement it. Okay. I think that's it.
Okay. And you will promise never to make peace again by yourself. Okay, Ambassador Ross.
That's the only problem. The answer is yes.
I think it's an interesting paradox. I think that one of the things we've learned now, especially with the last 2.5 years, is that the U.S. role is most important when the only dialogue that exists between the parties is a dialogue of violence. Because in those circumstances, the situation simply gets worse. They can't change the situation on their own. They need our help. But I also think, and this is where the paradox comes in, if we can recreate a set of circumstances where the intellectual realities that are understood are matched by a political environment that makes it possible to act on them, that's the point where our role becomes much more one of reassurance, assurance, guarantees, but letting them cross that final hurdle. In the near term, what it means is I think that we should be shepherding these Israeli-Palestinian talks so that understandings are reached, and so that the understandings that are reached are also understood the same way. One of my concerns is that, even assuming we see Abu Mazen emerge tomorrow, they will have discussions. They will reach certain understandings, and they will use the same words and mean entirely different things by them, so that when each gets disappointed by the other's response, we are right back to where we were, a sense of betrayal. The only way to avoid that, I think, is to make sure that you have the U.S. working with both sides as they reach these understandings, making certain that the same things are understood by both sides. And then I agree with Halil. I think there has to be monitoring and accountability. You used a term. I mean, I said, for me, the critical word is accountability. We are not going to restore belief. We haven't just lost trust.
Right.
We haven't just lost confidence. The two sides have lost faith and belief in this. They may both intellectually understand that the outcome has to be a two-state outcome, but neither believes that the other is ready for that, nor do they think that the other is committed to that. So until you can reestablish faith again, that there's partnership, little is going to change, and the only way that's going to work is by having enough demonstration of commitments made and fulfilled that both sides say, all right, now we can begin to see that there's a possibility again. So I think it requires us right now to shepherd this process. I think it requires very intensive monitoring. Where I may differ a little with Halil is not that the quartet doesn't have a role in monitoring, but I might divide up what the responsibilities would be with regard to what that monitoring has to be. I do think we would be the best judge on the security side. And I think there has to be an understanding that there can't be a rounding of the edges. In other words, we can't say for one or the other side that, well, they're doing good enough. You can't expect more of them, because that's going to become a prescription for not acting at all.
Okay, in our commitment here at the Kennedy School to active learning of students in the Harvard community, I would like to call upon students to come to the microphones first. Our ground rules, as usual, are as follows: that we act very strongly on the proposition that this is a civil community engaged in learning and dialogue. I would ask that each of you begin by identifying yourself and asking a question. That's a statement that sort of ends with a question mark. And to not make statements. I will be in front of our very important guests here, intervene to make sure that we are just hearing short questions. And let's begin over here.
My name is Josh Good, and I'm a student at Harvard Divinity School.
And please direct your question, if you wish to one of the panel or to all. So.
Okay, probably most for Ambassador Ross. I'd like to ask, since no explicit connection to change in regime in Iraq has been mentioned this evening, I'd like to ask for your perspective on that implication in terms of the long-term timing, and also what, if anything, you make of recent movement within the United States National Security Council, especially around neoconservative vision, Elliott Abrams, for example.
You're asking a question about regime change in the region as a whole, or specifically only with the Palestinians?
No, in Iraq.
Sort of the larger picture implications of Iraqi regime change as it pertains to Israeli-Palestinian potential peace.
Well, let me start by saying I have never been a big fan of what is called linkage in either direction. The concept of linkage, it seems to me, has always been fundamentally flawed, because Saddam Hussein didn't behave the way he did because of the Palestinians. And just because he disappears doesn't mean that the grievances, the gaps, the mistrust, the lack of faith suddenly disappears. I have always felt that we should have pursued Israeli-Palestinian peace, not because we had to worry about Saddam Hussein, not because we needed Arab support for Saddam Hussein, but because it was right on its own merits. The flip side of that is we're still going to have to contend with the Israeli-Palestinian issue in the aftermath of regime change within Iraq. It isn't to say that it may not create an environment that is more favorable for those in the Middle East who believe in reform. I think they will be emboldened. I think, by the way, the Islamicists will also be emboldened. And the interesting thing is, what are we going to do about that? But that's a different topic. In terms of this specifically, I don't see it having an immediate effect on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, other than the fact, from an Israeli standpoint, I think it's fair to say that they no longer face an Eastern Front the way they did, which means that the way they define their security is probably somewhat more favorable than it was before this. On the Palestinians, it's a reminder that regimes, by the way, do change. The fact is, as Halil was saying, we agree on a lot, and there's some things we probably disagree on, but on the issue of reform, reform is entirely homegrown on the Palestinian side. What gives it its authenticity is that it comes from within. The proof of that is, its real flowering, its real emergence came at a point when nobody expected it, in the aftermath of the Israeli Operation Defensive Shield. Then you saw, there was an expectation there'd be tremendous anger towards the Israelis, which there was, but there was also an incredible pressure for reform on the Palestinian side. Nobody predicted that. So this reflects a pronounced Palestinian need for change. And I do believe that, in fact, where Halil and I disagree is not on whether or not the Palestinian national movement is capable of making peace with Israel. Where we disagree is I don't believe that Arafat is capable of making peace with Israel. That's why I do think the reform movement is so important, because I see it representing two new important realities on the Palestinian side. One is it represents a bridge to the future, in the sense that it represents on the Palestinian side the need for change, to build their own state on the basis of transparency, accountability, a rule of law. Where Halil is quite right is that that was not a priority of the of the Israelis earlier on, nor was it a priority of ours. And you were in a forum where one of your colleagues asked me the question about this, and I said, we made a mistake. We should have emphasized reform as an essential part of this process. Had we, it might have been different. But we were operating on the assumption, quite honestly, that you could do peace with Arafat but not democracy. Democracy could come after peace. And one of the things we learned is if you didn't build a democracy there, you were very unlikely to get the peace. So I think pushing the reform movement now is critical. I don't think you have to use the term regime change. There is a reality that was embodied in President Bush's June 24 speech. Halil is concerned about what that speech means, but the fact is, if you're going to have American involvement, it's very clear. American involvement is not going to come as long as Arafat is seen as the leader on the Palestinian side. It's simply not going to happen. I'm not making an argument now, I'm stating a fact. So if the American involvement is critical to changing the reality, then having a prime minister emerge, who is not going to have all the powers that one might like to see him have, nonetheless, I think it's a sine qua non for being able to move forward. If it doesn't happen, then I will tell you that I'm afraid we're headed not towards a negotiated future, but a unilateral kind of future, meaning unilateral separation, unilateral disengagement, based on the fence.
Sir.
My name is Alexander Rasolimo. I'm president of Strategy Associates International. I was a participant in the Economic Summit of the Middle East and North Africa, held in 1994, a year after Oslo. It was labeled as the Casablanca Summit Investment in Peace. There was a lot of optimism and many proposals presented by business and governments for investments to foster economic growth in the region. As I recall, one of the speakers was future Harvard President Larry Summers. So my question is, what can the private sector, private enterprise, business, banks, and investors do to enhance the chance of peace with security in the Middle East region?
Me?
Go ahead.
To whom do you direct the question, to me or to whom? I'll tell you on my side, in Oslo we spoke a lot about economic issues. And there was Annex 3 and Annex 4 who spoke quite in detail about these things. That was never carried out. From the Israeli point of view, Israel needs security. If there is an act of violence, the only way Israel knows how to take care of it, if there's no full cooperation, means to stop everything on the Palestinian side and you see who's moving. So what you actually had is what became clear is that the security and non-violence was a precondition for economic development, because the Israeli policy of closures had a major damage on the economic situation on the Palestinian side. And it didn't make it actually possible to develop major economic development there. From Israeli point of view, this was clear self-defense. And it depended on the necessity to change the attitude on security issues on the Palestinian side. I believe a second big mistake was that, I would say, Shimon Peres himself created too much expectations. The talk about the new Middle East was, forgive me, unrealistic. And there was another mistake that Peres's emphasis was, to my understanding, more on relations with the Arab world and less on the Israeli-Palestinian level. And it was necessary to create a sense of security in Israeli-Palestinian relations before actually going too much out on the wider thing, because this was all built on sand. I don't know how much this satisfies you. Much more to say.
Yes, up here, please.
Yes, hello. My name is Maria Steffen. I'm a PhD candidate at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. My question, recently Thomas Friedman has written in a couple of New York Times columns about the need for the deployment of international peacekeepers as part of the stabilization phase. And I'm wondering, I wanted to ask the panelists what they thought about this option, both as a way to promote trust building, confidence building measures, and as a way to sort of dismantle the checkpoint culture that is preventing ordinary people from both sides from coming together, which I would say ultimately is what is necessary to build a constituency for peace. So if you could comment on the role that possibly international peacekeepers, including NATO, could play.
If it is meant to sustain the occupation, there is no doubt that the Palestinians will oppose any deployment of any international forces, NATO or otherwise. But if it is meant to protect the peace, if it is meant to assure the Israelis about their own security as they withdraw from Palestinian land and allow Palestinians to become independent and have their own state, I believe the Palestinians will be supportive of it. So it depends on the political context that comes with it. If it has no political context, if it is just meant to add a further element of security into the context of Israeli-Palestinian relationship, then I think it certainly is going to exacerbate the situation rather than improve it. Both Palestinians and Israelis are highly skeptical about any international deployment of forces. Palestinians in particular are very suspicious of any American deployment of forces, and Israelis are suspicious of any European deployment of forces. And I think there is a realization on both sides, Palestinians and Israelis, that it's not a question of an international force coming into the West Bank and Gaza, providing security. That the issue here, and this is also true with regard to the economic issue, this hegemony of security and the Israeli desire to have security come first at the expense of everything else means that the Palestinians are incapable of delivering that security unless it is part and parcel of their complete independence and end of occupation, which means everything else would have to, therefore, to come to be secondary, and that's economic progress as well as any international role. You can have an international role, and it could be an enforcement role, but only if it is part of a political context that both Israelis and Palestinians can live with.
Can I just add to this? When we were at Camp David, there was an agreement by the two sides that in the aftermath of an agreement, both sides were in favor of having an international presence. In fact, both sides at that time were in favor of having it U.S.-led. And I think I agree with you. I'm very much concerned about those who think that there's a quick fix solution by putting American or other troops in place of ours. Unless it's part of an understanding with the two sides, you're going to find they become a target maybe for both. The Israelis who see them blocking their ability to respond to threats, the Palestinians who see them enforcing what will be a prolonged occupation. And in such circumstances, I think we end up being the big losers. We don't transform the situation, and you will produce, I'm afraid, the reason for us to withdraw from involvement. And if we have to play a central role, this isn't going to be the way to ensure that we do it.
Sir.
Hi, my name is Paul Savitz. I'm not a student at Harvard, a student at Brown. My question is for Mr. Ross. I was wondering why it seems that so little attention was paid to the constant incitement on the Palestinian side towards violence against Israelis, when it seems that this should have been just screaming in the face of everyone who was trying to bring peace to both sides. If one side is in music videos and religious services that are broadcast on state TV and the state-run radio consistently calling for violence against the other side. Why was it that this didn't immediately just discredit, I don't know about discredit Arafat, but show that his true desire was not peace? And a follow-up question is...
Let's just hold there so that the ambassador can
sorry.
answer that. Go ahead.
Well, I think you're raising a real issue. I think the examples you're citing now are much truer in the last 2 years than they were in the period prior to that time. But there were examples prior to that time, and we did raise them. I'll tell you, we became wedded to the process. And there were a lot of things that we could have done that we didn't do because it was somehow seen as disruptive to the process. Some of what we should have done, we should have made certain issues public, and we didn't. This is a process that we came to believe had enormous promise. We became convinced it could be done. Ironically, we also had both sides at different points. In a sense, ironically, this was sort of the proof of Oslo at different points, both sides sort of saying, well, cut them a little slack. This was true, ironically, with Rabin for Arafat, and at times Arafat for Rabin. Arafat, interestingly enough, on the settlement issue. During Rabin's time, Arafat never raised settlements as an issue, never. Guys around him would, but he wouldn't. And Rabin, at different points, would tell us, don't press Arafat too hard, especially on some of the human rights issues and even on some of the incitement issues. So, in a sense, this was kind of a reminder that leaders can come to certain understandings that can nonetheless be corrosive in terms of what you're trying to do, because if it doesn't affect the larger public attitudes, you don't make peace. Peace is built, as we learn, not only from the top down, but also from the bottom up. When I talk about conditioning for peace, we needed to create people-to-people programs. In the interim agreement, there was a whole annex devoted to people-to-people programs, but we paid lip service to it. We didn't commit to it in a way that would have broken down the barriers, would have made it harder to do this. And again, it comes back to the issue of accountability. There were commitments made in the agreements against incitement, and we didn't do enough to press those. So, I mean, when I have a book that will come out, and one of the reasons for writing it and telling the story is to, remind all of us of what went wrong and learn the lessons from it. What's the point of repeating and learning and mislearning all the same things from the past?
Thank you. My name is Charlie Fryfeld. I'm a businessman, and I'm just interested in the Arab-Israeli issues. A question for Mr. Chataki, I think your name is. So I'd like to understand better something you said. I've been really focusing on the language that's used in talking about this conflict. You said earlier that neither side thinks there's a partner on the other side to negotiate with. And that doesn't seem correct to me, and I want to ask you again whether you really believe that. It seems to me that on the Israeli side, there is a partner. There's Ariel Sharon. Now, the Palestinians may not like him. They may not like what he's after in his bargaining, but he's actually a person that you can bargain with, and you may have to walk away from him. But he's a legitimately elected leader. On the other hand, you said that Abu Mazen was not particularly liked by the Palestinians because he might do things that were detrimental to them, or they didn't like, and there was some kind of struggle going on. It doesn't seem like it's fair to say that neither side has a partner on either side. It's not like they're equal. They're really, I don't understand that. I mean, do you really believe that's an equal thing, that there are two partners and nobody can find a partner there?
Well, I was describing the perceptions. You're now asking me whether I thought the perceptions were accurate. What I described as perception is accurate, that this is the prevailing perception among Israelis and Palestinians. Whether, in fact, Sharon is a partner for the Palestinians is a question that is difficult to answer. I tend to believe that Sharon is not a partner for the Palestinians, at least in permanent status negotiations. I don't believe that the Palestinians and Israelis under Sharon would be able to reach a permanent status agreement. Whether it is possible for Sharon to be a partner for any Palestinian leader on the roadmap is a little bit more open for discussion. But that, I believe, is very much dependent on strong, effective, determined American leadership. I do not believe that Sharon is ready to evacuate a single Israeli settlement in the West Bank and Gaza. I might be wrong, but I believe he is not and will not, on his own, do anything to impede the continuation of the settlement enterprise. But I also know that unless the administration, the Bush administration, makes it very clear to him that he must, as part of the implementation of the roadmap, evacuate a number of settlements in the West Bank and almost all the settlements in the Gaza Strip, there isn't going to be any roadmap to be implemented. Now, you tell me, if you think that Sharon is capable of doing that, whether Arafat is a partner for the Israelis, I disagree with Dennis. I do believe that Arafat can be a partner for Israel. He might be a very tough negotiator, and he might be very, very slow in reaching decisions and making decisions. That he takes his time, and he needs to build legitimacy, traditional sources of legitimacy around himself before committing to a deal with Israel. So I have no doubt that if Arafat finds his most senior trusted advisors, people like Abu Mazen and Abu Ala, ready to advise him on a deal with on a permanent status deal with Israel, I believe Arafat would be willing to do that, and I believe Arafat would be willing to sign on a deal that would be acceptable to the majority of the Israelis.
Up here, and then we'll take one more question after that, please.
Hi. My name is Oren Weinrib. My question, in a way, follows up on the previous one. Bracketing for a second whether violence is a legitimate means of achieving political ends, as it was in Iraq and many other places, not legitimate but used. So setting that issue aside, I'm wondering, isn't there a gross asymmetry in the power between the two negotiating parties? I haven't really heard that talked about. To use a simple metaphor, like Israel is the 12th grader and the Palestinians are the 10-year-old kid in terms of, one's a state with an army and one's not. So I'm wondering, to continue that metaphor, isn't there a role perhaps in order to achieve a settlement that a quote-unquote neutral observer might see as equitable for the US or some other power to play the role of the Palestinians' big brother, and whether the US might be able to play that role in this case by using the carrot or stick, as you see it, of the billions of dollars of aid that it gives to Israel?
Let me answer to the first part of your question. Whether the use of violence is legitimate or not, according to Oslo, it was not legitimate. But it was definitely not effective, because the assumption that the Israeli public will support major concessions to go to a permanent status under violence, well, during negotiations, the Palestinians start violence is an assumption out of this world. So there's no question, and we told with no question that the violence after 28th of September did bring Sharon to power. And I do disagree with the Palestinian claim that Sharon's visit to the Haram al-Sharif or the Temple Mountain did cause, it was used to your violence, but violence was prepared from March onward. And they were thinking of violence and talk about violence, which grew from March onward, and particularly after Lebanon. So the effectiveness of violence on the Palestinian side was to get the counter reaction on the Israeli side, and it has caused a major move to the right in the Israeli public. I believe that the opposite would be true too, that if there is a Palestinian peace plan, if there's a Palestinian peace plan along the Clinton proposals, which says there's two-state solution, there's on the territorial thing, there's a 100% deal on the West Bank, and there is a fair and just solution to the Palestinian refugee problem, but no right of return to Israel, which will maintain Israel as the state of the Jewish people. I believe that under these conditions, you will get the majority of the Israeli public to go along with the peace deal. And I believe that we can develop this kind of mechanism. Now, even international role, what has been said here is the importance of the international role is to create the political will, to show there's political will and determination to move ahead. And then if technically there should be more support on a lot of institution building activities by the international community, the answer is maybe yes, maybe not. What is important is that legitimacy for peace must come from the Palestinian people, and not only from the international community.
Okay, what I want to do is we're going to go up here, then we're going to go over here, and you're going to get the last. What I want you to do is just to pose the question, and then we'll have responses.
My name is Yossi Klicksberg. I'll be a future student at JFK. This question is for
Hopefully.
Mr. Shikaki. You manage the best statistics on the Palestinian society. How can you explain from an academic or intellectual perspective why, how the phenomenon of terrorism happens, why there's martyrdom, and why there are shaheeds?
Okay.
Josh Katzen from the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, a defense policy think tank in Washington. It's a question for Ambassador Ross. The Palestinians have long supported terrorism. They supported Saddam Hussein in 1991, and in 2003, as recently as a few weeks ago, calling for chemical bombs to be used on Tel Aviv. They danced in the street on September 11th when the United States was hit. They support suicide bombers, airplane hijackers, and the murder of civilians. Poll after poll taken by the Palestinians shows 75 to 80% of the population supports the continued use of violence, even in the context of negotiations. Now comes the roadmap in which the United States is supposed to support a state and relying on a change in attitude. Don't you really think that such deep-seated attitudes will take more than a few weeks to change, perhaps generations?
Okay, thank you. Last.
Thank you. Deborah Kaufman, University of Massachusetts, Boston. This question is addressed to all three of you gentlemen. You were introduced as scholars practitioners, which was very impressive. And I'd like to know, at this point in the conflict, where each of you three see yourselves as practitioners in your various capacities. Thank you.
Okay. So,
I'll answer the question on violence. I've been doing public opinion among Palestinians for the past 10 years. And if there is any conclusion that I have on Palestinian support for violence, it is that violence, the support for violence, is very much correlated with Palestinian threat perception. If there is a threat, and it could be threat to the land, threat to independence, it could be also the Palestinian profound sense of injustice and humiliation. In 1995-96, the mid-90s, the percentage of Palestinians who supported violence didn't exceed 20-25% at best. Today, we have support for violence ranging between anywhere 50% to 75%. And it's a reflection of loss of hope that diplomacy alone can deliver end of occupation, vital Palestinian objectives, and that sense of humiliation and injustice and desire for revenge that comes as a result of the imposition of collective punishment, as well as the confiscation of land, the building of settlements. If you believe that violence is the only alternative available to you, then there is no doubt that you will resort to violence. And we have seen in public opinion surveys the Palestinians almost immediately after Netanyahu became prime minister beginning to lose hope that negotiations alone will be able to deliver Palestinian statehood and end of occupation. And it wasn't, however, until later, until the failure to reach an agreement at all at Camp David, that in fact we began to see a majority of Palestinians willing to support violence, and as a result we've also seen, just a few months later, we've seen the eruption of the Intifada.
to pick up any pieces of the other questions.
On violence started when there was an Israeli peace government. Anyway, but it was before Oslo, but the main, on practitioners, I never was in government, but not being in government, I did have an impact on moving on the Oslo negotiations. Now I'm involved in an activity. We have an ongoing, very intense dialogue with the Palestinians, with a variety of Palestinian groups, and we act as intermediaries between ourselves, between the Palestinians, international community, and even our government, which we're not very much in love with. We are establishing 15 working groups on all issues which are related to permanent status, which will have about 150 of the most of what you would call the non-political government of Israel. We have in each working group 3-4 former director generals of ministries. We have a chief of staff in our working group. We have the former director general of the Ministry of Defense in our working groups. So we are working, we are moving from the intellectual thinking to the institutional building of it. We are not yet in the decision-making process, unfortunately, on that. We're not practitioners.
I would answer the question on violence in the following way. The premise of the question was that violence is kind of endemic to the Palestinians, and therefore you can't rely upon the roadmap, which is too short a time horizon. I would also agree with the questioner that if the issue is a couple of weeks of performance, I don't buy it either. What you've got to see is a kind of serious commitment that reflects two things. One, I'd like to see a manifesto. I'd like to see it be a joint manifesto between the Troika, the Arab Troika, and the Palestinian government that emerges, that makes it clear that there's a Palestinian compact, makes it clear what the Palestinians stand for, makes it clear what they stand against, and it acts to discredit violence as a tool, that makes it clear that those who carry it out to oppose peaceful coexistence will not be tolerated and will be treated as enemies of the cause. Now that, frankly, would also represent a kind of revolution, because what we saw in the last decade is that violence was frequently glorified, even during periods when it wasn't necessarily being promoted the way it was later. But you can't make martyrs of everybody who's a suicide bomber and then somehow say that you have a zero tolerance for terror. That's a contradiction. That has to change. So I think that does have to change, but I also think that when you set out to prove that violence is futile, which is what the Sharon government has been determined to do, and to some extent I think they have succeeded, because I think we do see in the polls now a different Palestinian attitude than we were seeing, say, 3 months earlier. But when you set out to prove that violence is futile, you also have to do something else. You also have to show that if you forsake violence, there's a political pathway that will not be futile, and that the aspirations that you have will be addressed. I would like very much to see more of a public effort made by this Israeli government to reach out to Palestinians. Not with any false impression that this is suddenly going to transform the situation. Because both sides are going to have to speak differently, and their actions are going to have to reflect different words. On the Israeli side, there has to be an effort to say, we understand we can't control you. We understand you think we want to control you. We don't. We understand you want independence, and in fact, we have to produce a process that will yield that. But violence is not going to produce a Palestinian state. There'll be no state born of violence. That needs to be understood, because that's the truth. What Yair said is right. Basically, the Intifada and Yasser Arafat killed the peace camp in Israel. You want to change the realities in Israel? Have the Palestinians make it clear that they have truly forsaken this. You want to change the realities on the Palestinian side? Make it clear that they can begin to produce, and that in fact there's a pathway here that's credible on their terms. In the end, if we're going to move from the intellectual reality, that ultimately the end game here is no mystery. The problem is getting to a point, and you're trying to build that point, getting to a point where you don't just have an institutional understanding, but you have a political environment where everybody understands that what is today in truth no mystery is translated into creating a new reality. Unfortunately, we're a long ways away from that. 2.5 years ago, we were not a long ways away from that. But violence has produced a big gap And it means that more time is going to be required. And unfortunately, if we look at the history of this conflict, time is usually measured in blood.
Let me just offer this concluding comment and send you on your way. My sense is that what you've witnessed tonight and heard tonight is both the special nature and uniqueness of this individual that we like to call the scholar practitioner. And my sense is that this is the kind of individual who takes political, who takes emotional and intellectual risks for peace. These are three individuals who have acted time and again, and not just written about the difficulties of peace. But importantly, from the scholarly side, they have taken the time to reflect upon their actions, to think systematically about what social science scholars, what historians, what anthropologists have to say about conflict and conflict resolution. And most importantly, these are individuals who, after acting and reflecting, have the courage to intervene again in the face of resistance. And so on behalf of the Kennedy School and Harvard University, I want to take this opportunity to thank the three of you for a very exciting and compelling evening. Okay, I take you to the airport.